Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Victorio Peak treasure. There's a question that has been asked in one form or another every decade for nearly 90 years. The question is this: is there gold inside a small, unremarkable mountain in southern New Mexico? And if so, who put it there and where has it gone? The mountain is Victorio Peak. The gold was allegedly discovered by a traveling foot doctor named Doc Noss on a November afternoon in 1937, when a current of air rising from a hole in the desert rock led him into a network of caverns that he would spend the rest of his life trying to recover. By the time he was shot dead in 1949, the treasure was legally inaccessible, physically inaccessible, and surrounded by a web of competing claims that has only grown more tangled in the 75 years since his death. The U.S. Army controls the peak. The Noss family asserts the claim. Lawyers, geophysicists, television documentarians, and the occasional senators have all taken their turn with the story, and the story has absorbed all of them without resolution. What follows is the full account: the desert and its history, the man and his discovery, the gold and its possible origin, the government and its long silence, and the family that cannot let go. It is a story about wealth and about the impossibility of wealth in certain historical moments. It is a story about the American West and the accumulated weight of everything that happened there before the 20th century arrived and renamed it all. It is a story about the particular human incapacity to accept that some questions simply do not get answered, that some doors, once sealed by tons of collapsed desert rocks and the classified authority of a missile range, do not reopen. Settle in. The desert night is long and there is much to tell. Chapter 1. The Desert at the Edge of the World. There is a place in southern New Mexico where the land seems to have forgotten time. You can stand in the Hembrio Basin and feel it. A silence so complete that the faint creak of your own boots becomes an intrusion. The basin is a shallow, ancient lake bed, its floor cracked and pale as old bone, ringed by the jagged dark ridges of the San Andreas Mountains. The sky above is the particular blue of high desert, deep, almost violet at the zenith, fading into a bleach white where it meets the horizon. In the summer, the air shimmers and bends with heat. In the winter, the cold arrives without warning and without apology. This is the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest desert in North America, stretching from southern New Mexico in west Texas deep into the interior of Mexico. It covers roughly 200,000 square miles, an expanse so vast that it dwarfs most nations. Unlike the Sonoran Desert to its west, which is famous for the saguaro cactus and a certain cinematic quality, the Chihuahuan is subtler in its drama. It is a land of creosotes and lechugia, of honey mesquite and soto, punctuated by the sudden drama of mountain ranges that rise without preamble from flat desert floor. These ranges, the San Andreas, the Organ Mountains, the Escura, the Fra Cristobal, are called sky islands, and that name feels right. They are isolated worlds, complete in themselves, rising from the desert like thoughts rising from quiet. The San Andreas Mountains run roughly north to south for about 60 miles, and within their lower reaches at the western edge of the range, the Hembrio Basin sits enclosed and private. Hembrio is Spanish for a type of wild fig, though the fig itself is no longer common here. The basin is roughly circular, perhaps 10 miles across, and from its center, you can see in every direction the folded ranks of rock that surround it. The rock itself tells a long story. The geology of the Tularosa Basin in the San Andreas Mountains is a record of Permian and Carboniferous sedimentary accumulation, with older Precambrian metamorphic rock beneath. The visible formation, the Abo and Viso formations, are made up of mud rocks and sandstones that erode in characteristic steps, sandstone caps holding against the weather, while the softer argillaceous layers between them give way. The regional dip is gentle, about 10 degrees to the west, which means the strata tilt slightly as you move through them, like pages in a book that has been tilted on its shelf. This matters to the story of Victorio Peak because of what that particular geology can produce. Carbonate rocks, limestone and dolomite, are susceptible to dissolution by acidic groundwater, a process called karstification. Over millions of years, as slightly acidic water works its way through cracks and bedding planes, it dissolves the rock from within, hollowing out chambers and passages that can grow to extraordinary size. The American Southwest is riddled with karst caves. Carlsbad Cavern, just over 100 miles to the east, is the most famous, its main chamber large enough to hold several football fields. But Carlsbad is not unique. The same geological processes that create it operate throughout the region, in countless mountains and hills, producing cavern systems that have never been fully mapped, and in some cases, never been found at all. Victorio Peak, a craggy, rocky promontory, rising perhaps 500 feet above the basin floors, sits within this same geological province. Whether it contains significant cavern systems is a question that has never been definitively answered. And that unanswered question is the engine of everything that follows. The peak itself is not imposing by any conventional measure. It rises to an elevation of about 6,350 feet above sea level, which sounds substantial until you realize the basin floor around it is already quite high. The peak is not a towering spire, but a rough, broken mass of rock, its flanks littered with boulders, its summit ragged and windswept. It is the kind of mountain that a hiker might pass without a second look, but the land around it carries a weight that has nothing to do with elevation. It is a place where history has accumulated in layers, where the deep human past and the recent human present press against each other in uncomfortable proximity. Apache warriors sheltered here. Soldiers died here, and somewhere within or around this unremarkable pile of desert rock, according to one man's testimony and decades of subsequent obsession, there is enough gold to rewrite the financial histories of several nations. Beyond the Hembrio Basin, stretching to the south and east, is a stretch of desert that the Spanish named the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. It is one of the most evocative place names in the American Southwest, and it earned that name honestly. For the Spanish colonial expeditions moving north out of Mexico, the Jornada was the most feared section of the Camino Real, the royal road that connected Mexico City to the northern settlements of New Mexico. The road here departs from the Rio Grande for roughly 90 miles, cutting across waterless desert to avoid a narrow, impassable canyon in the river. 90 miles without reliable water, in summer heat that can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with the added possibility of Apache attack. The bones of those who did not survive the crossing are in the earth here, having returned quietly to the desert that took them. It is through this landscape that everything in the story moves, the gold, if there is gold, and the people who have spent their lives in pursuit of it. The Jornada del Muerto is not merely a backdrop. It is a kind of argument, a reminder that the desert keeps its secrets not through any mystical agency, but through simple, brutal indifference. It does not care about wealth or law, or family legacy, or national security. It simply endures, while the humans who move across it diminish and eventually stop moving altogether. To understand why the Hembrio Basin has become such a powerful container for mystery and legend, it helps to understand the full depth of human history that has accumulated there. The San Andreas Mountains were not empty before the Spanish arrived. They were not empty before the Apache. Archaeologists working in the region have documented occupation of the Tularosa Basin and its surrounding ranges, going back thousands of years through cultures whose names we have assigned, but whose inner lives remain largely opaque to us. The Jornada Mogollon, the precursor people of the later Pueblo traditions, hunter-gatherers bands whose seasonal movements followed the water and the game through terrain that has changed far less in the past 10,000 years than most American landscapes have. There are the petroglyphs in the San Andreas, images pecked into dark desert varnish by hands whose owners have been gone for centuries. The mountains have been watched, camped in, used and understood by people across an enormous span of time, and that accumulated human presence, even when it has left no obvious marks on the surface, gives the land a quality that is difficult to name but easy to feel. It is also worth understanding the specific character of the Chihuahuan desert ecosystem, because the desert is not simply a backdrop in this story. It is an active participant. The Chihuahuan desert is, by most measure, the biologically richest desert in North America, a fact that surprises many people who associate deserts with sterility. It receives more rainfall than the Mojave or the Great Basin Desert to its north and west, and that rainfall concentrated in a monsoon season from July through September supports a diversity of plant and animal life that is genuinely remarkable. More than 3,000 plant species, 170 species of reptiles, 60 species of fish native to its river systems, and more species of bats than any other region in North America. The Chihuahuan Desert is, in ecological terms, a world of astonishing complexity, hidden inside an appearance of desolation. The desert's apparent desolation is one of its most important features for the story we are telling. The same aridity that makes human habitation difficult, that concentrates the population in the river valleys and leaves the mountain ranges between them largely empty of permanent settlement, also creates conditions in which things can be hidden effectively. The desert's climate is destructive of organic material, wood, leather, fabric, but remarkably preserving of metal and stone. Gold, in particular, is chemically inert in the desert environment. It does not oxidize or corrode, does not react with the alkaline soils, does not break down under ultraviolet light. A gold bar buried in the Chihuahuan Desert in the 17th century would look essentially the same in the 21st century as the day it was buried. The desert keeps its metal secrets with a fidelity that no human archive can match. This is the world into which, on a November day in 1937, a man named Milton Ernest Noss descended into a hole in the ground and allegedly changed his life forever. Chapter 2. Doc Noss in the Hole in the Mountain. Milton Ernest Noss was born in 1905 in Oklahoma, and from his earliest years he had the particular restlessness of a man who finds the present moment insufficient. He moved through the Southwest like a season, settling briefly before the next impulse carried him onward. By his late 30s, he had been a small-time entrepreneur, a traveling medicine show operator, and a self-described foot doctor. A chiropodist, though his formal credentials in that field were, at best, loosely documented. His nickname, Doc, had the slightly ironic quality of many frontier nicknames. It spoke to a kind of aspiration as much as any actual qualification. In 1933, Doc Noss married Ova Beckworth, a woman of formidable character who would prove to be a more durable figure in the story that was about to unfold. Ova was known by the nickname Babe, and she was, by all accounts, a practical, determined woman who had grown up in the rhythms of rural New Mexico and understood the desert in a way that her restless husband sometimes did not. They settled in Hot Springs, New Mexico, a small town that would later, in one of the more whimsical civic decisions of the 20th century, rename itself Truth or Consequences after a popular radio program. Together, they made a life in the margins of the Depression-era Southwest, never quite prosperous, but never quite broke, moving through a world where the difference between those two states was measured in inches. November of 1937 found Doc Noss on a deer hunting trip into the Hembrio Basin. He went with Babe and several others, and they made camp on the flat ground at the base of Victorio Peak. The men went out to hunt while the women stayed at camp, and Doc, hunting alone, climbed the rocky flanks of the peak. Accounts vary slightly in their detail: the desert light, the sound of a distant storm, the particular way the afternoon had turned. But the essential moment is consistent across every telling. Doc was sheltering under a rocky overhang near the summit when he felt something unusual, a faint current of air brushing against his leg, rising from the ground. He looked down. There was a hole. It was not a large hole, not immediately visible as anything significant, just a narrow opening in the rock, perhaps large enough for a slender person to squeeze through. But air was moving through it, and moving air in a desert mountain means one thing: there is somewhere for it to go. Doc explored the opening and discovered that it widened below the surface, and that there was already in place an old wooden ladder descending into the darkness. Someone, at some point in the past, had known about this opening, had prepared for descent. He had installed the infrastructure of entry. Doc returned to camp and told Babe what he had found. Whatever her private thoughts about her husband's excitability, she recognized that this particular story had a different quality. They returned to the peak together, equipped with rope and flashlight, and Doc went down. What he found below the surface, he would describe for the rest of his life with a consistency that his advocates cite as evidence of truthfulness, and his skeptics cite as evidence of a well-rehearsed story. He descended through a narrow vertical fissure in the rock, perhaps 100 feet, squeezing under boulders and through constrictions that required him to exhale to fit through, and emerged into a network of tunnels and chambers within the mountain's interior. The caverns were not merely geological curiosities. They were occupied, not by living beings, but by the accumulated evidence of human presence across a span of centuries that Doc could not immediately measure. Doc Noss descended down 100 feet of vertical fissure in the dark with a flashlight and a rope, in a cave system whose geography he did not yet know, a mountain whose stability he could not assess. This is not a casual undertaking. Many people confronted with that opening in the rock, and the first impression of depth below would have stopped, would have made a mental note, gone back to camp, told a story over dinner, maybe returned with a proper kit the next day. Doc went down alone, on the first occasion, with only the equipment he had brought for a deer hunt. Whether this reflects courage, recklessness, or simply the particular temperament of a man who had spent his life in the margins of conventional existence, it speaks to someone for whom the unknown was an invitation rather than a warning. There were human skeletons, dozens of them. Some, Doc claimed, were chained to the floor or to the walls, as though placed there deliberately, as prisoners or as guardians. The chained skeletons are one of the details that has attracted the most attention and speculation. Chaining human beings in a cave would be an extraordinary act in any historical context, and the question of who was chained there and why, and by whom, is one of the most disturbing elements of the whole story. Under the Spanish colonial theory, they might represent indigenous slaves forced to carry treasure into the cave, killed and chained there to prevent them from ever revealing its location, a grim practice that has historical precedent in the extreme violence of Spanish colonial administration. Under other theories, they might be something else entirely. The detail is sufficiently specific and sufficiently disturbing to resist easy categorization as embellishment. There were artifacts, armor from the Spanish colonial period, its metal dark and pitted with age. There were chests and containers, some of them bearing inscriptions in Old English and in Spanish. There was gold crown, detailed and heavy. There were jewels. There were documents aged to fragility, some of them dated in what appeared to be late 18th century. Doc reported that some of these documents appeared to be ecclesiastic in nature, possibly translations or certifications of some kind, though their precise content was beyond his ability to assess, given the speed and disorientation of his initial descent. There were pouches in packs whose contents Doc barely registered because his attention had fixed on something far more immediate. Stacked along the walls of the cavern, in rooms that opened one into another through passages he had to crawl through, were bars of dark metals, thousands of them, stacked like firewood, as he would always say, that specific homely image, firewood stack in a cave, which has a quality of the accidentally observed that rings oddly authentic. He counted as best he could in the flashlight-lit dark, and arrived at a number that ranged, in his various tellings, between 15 and 16,000 bars. He assumed at first that they were pig iron or perhaps lead. Babe, who could not fit through the entry passage herself, insisted that he bring some up to show her. He obliged with one small bar, carrying it through the constriction and up the ladder, and brought it into the desert sunlight. When Babe turned it over, she noticed something catching the light. Beneath the dark oxidized surface, where the bar had been scuffed or worn, there was a gleam of yellow. They looked at each other across the bar in their hands, and in that moment, whatever their lives had been before became suddenly irrelevant. The bars were gold. If Doc's count was anywhere near accurate, and if they were what they appeared to be, then the value of what lay in that mountain was beyond any framework that either of them had ever inhabited. At today's gold prices, 16,000 bars at an estimated 80 pounds each would represent a quantity of gold worth something in the range of $100 billion. Even a fraction of that number was incomprehensible wealth. What they did next reveals something important about the particular historical moment in which this discovery allegedly occurred. It was 1937, and 4 years earlier, President Franklin Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 6102, which required all American citizens to surrender their privately held gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency at the fixed rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. This order had been issued in April 1933 under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act as an emergency measure to stabilize the banking system during the depths of the Great Depression. The Gold Reserve Act of January 1934 had formalized and expanded the order, making it illegal for private citizens to own gold in quantities above a minimal threshold, with violations punishable by up to 10 years in prison and fines of $10,000, a sum equivalent to well over $100,000 today. The practical effect of this law on Doc and Babe Noss cannot be overstated. Even if they had found exactly what Doc claimed, they could not simply carry it to a bank or a gold dealer. The gold itself was contraband. Private gold ownership would not be legalized again until President Gerald Ford signed Public Law 93-373 in August 1974, meaning that the gold would remain legally untouchable for another 37 years from the moment of its supposed discovery. This is not a minor complication in the story. It is the complication, the fulcrum around which everything else pivots. It explains why Doc Noss behaved as he did in the years that followed, secretively, erratically, hiding bars in the desert, trusting no one, making deals he could not honor, and explains why the story remained unresolved for so long. in the spring of 1938, 6 months after the initial discovery. Doc and Babe made the journey to Santa Fe to establish their legal claim to the site. They filed a lease with the state of New Mexico for the land surrounding Victorio Peak, and subsequently filed mining claims on and around the peak. They also filed a treasure trove claim, establishing in the legal record their assertion that they found something of value. With these filings, the story moved from private experience to public record, and the gears of consequence began to turn. Doc went back to the mountain again and again over the following 2 years. The descent was dangerous and demanding. The 100-foot vertical fissure required a slender body and a tolerance for confined spaces that not many people possessed. Doc was reportedly the only person who could navigate the passage reliably, which meant that the work of extraction fell almost entirely on him. He would descend, sometimes several times a day, and haul bars up to the surface one at a time, or in small quantities. The bars were heavy. Reports suggested they weighed anywhere from 25 to 80 pounds each, significantly heavier than standard gold bullion bars, which typically weighs about 27 pounds. Over the course of roughly 2 years, Doc claimed to have brought up somewhere between 200 and 250 bars. To put the weight in perspective, a standard modern gold bar, the kind stored in Fort Knox, weighs about 400 troy ounces, which works out to approximately 27.4 pounds. But Doc's bars, if they were of Spanish colonial manufacture, would have been cast differently, cruder in their production, less uniformed in their dimensions. Spanish colonial gold bars, called teos or lingotes, were typically cast in rough bar or wedge shapes, and varied considerably in weight and purity. The weight figure given by Doc and Babe, some bars allegedly weighing up to 80 pounds, would be consistent with large, crudely cast bars from an era before standardized bullion production. At 80 pounds per bar, 16,000 bars would represent approximately 640,000 pounds of gold, or roughly 320 tons. At 27 pounds per bar, closer to the standard modern weight, 16,000 bars would be about 216 pounds, or 108 tons. Either figure represents a quantity of gold that would, at current prices, be worth between $100 and $300 billion, depending on the weight assumed. The total above-ground gold supply in the entire world, as of the 21st century, is estimated at around 190,000 metric tons. The Victorio Peak treasure would represent something between a fraction of a percent and 2% of all the gold ever mined by human civilization. That is an extraordinary claim. It is not, on purely geological ground, an impossible one. He could not sell them. He could not take them to a bank. He could not, without extraordinary legal risk, tell anyone official about them. And so he hid them, scattered throughout the desert surrounding Victorio Peak, in locations that only he knew. The gold bars accumulated, a private treasury buried in the desert, inaccessible for reasons of law as much as reasons of geography. Doc became increasingly paranoid and secretive, unwilling to share the precise locations even with Babe. Their marriage, already strained by the pressures of Depression-era poverty, began to fracture under the weight of wealth they could not use. It is worth pausing here to consider the psychological dimension of Doc's situation. because it is genuinely unusual in a way that the story does not always make clear. He had, or believed he had, found one of the largest treasures in human history, and he could do nothing with it, not because it was inaccessible. He had already removed hundreds of bars, but because the legal framework of the country he lived in had made that treasure worthless in any practical sense. The Great Depression had prompted Franklin Roosevelt to reshape the fundamental relationship between American citizens and gold, and the result was that the most valuable thing Doc Noss had ever found was also the most legally dangerous thing he could possess. The psychological pressure of that situation, sitting on an alleged fortune that could not be spent, could not be banked, could not be spoken about to anyone in authority, could not be used to help his family or improve his circumstances, must have been extraordinary. It helps explain the erratic, secretive behavior that characterized the rest of his life. Then came the disaster. The fall of 1939, Doc decided that the entry passage needed to be enlarged. The 100-foot squeeze was simply too limiting. It prevented Babe from ever descending, prevented any meaningful assistance with extraction, and slowed the work to an exasperating crawl. He hired a mining engineer named S.E. Montgomery to assess the situation and recommend a course of action. Montgomery suggested that 8 sticks of dynamite would do the job, blast the passage wide enough to walk through, make the whole operation efficient and manageable. Doc disagreed. He knew the mountain in a way that the engineer did not, had spent hundreds of hours inside it, and had felt the way the rock moved and settled and groaned. He thought the mountain was too unstable for that much explosive. The engineer, confident in his credentials, prevailed. The explosion went off, and the mountain, as Doc had predicted, collapsed inward. The fragile shaft filled with debris. The passage was sealed under the tons of rock and rubble. In a single moment of technical overconfidence, everything they had worked toward became inaccessible. The treasure, if it existed, was gone, not taken, not moved, simply buried more deeply than before, behind a barrier of collapsed rock that no individual excavation effort could easily clear. Doc's response to this catastrophe speaks to his character. He abandoned Babe. He left the claim, the marriage, the site, and the whole accumulated wreckage of the past 2 years and simply disappeared into the broader Southwest, taking his knowledge of where the hidden bars were buried with him. He returned to a peripatetic life, moving from place to place with a rootlessness that looked from the outside like a man in flight. In November 1945, a divorce was granted, and 4 years later, in 1949, Doc Noss remarried, taking as his wife Violet Lena Bowles. He also returned to Victorio Peak. Chapter 3: Blood in the Desert. With this new marriage, Doc also had a new plan. The plan was straightforward in concept, if not in execution. Hire someone to fund a proper excavation of the collapsed shaft, get back inside the mountain, and recover what remained. The bars Doc had already pulled out between 1937 and 1939, somewhere between 200 and 250 of them, buried in scattered desert locations whose coordinates only he knew, were still out there in the sand, still legally untouchable, still waiting. But they were not enough. The real treasure, if Doc's account were accurate, was still sealed inside. The world Doc returned to was also, by 1949, beginning to change around Victorio Peak in ways he could not fully see yet. The war had ended 4 years earlier. and its ending had transformed the American Southwest. The White Sand Proving Ground, established in 1944 and redesignated the White Sands Missile Range in 1958, had been expanding steadily through the post-war years. Its boundaries had not yet reached Victorio Peak. That would come in 1955, but the military presence in southern New Mexico was growing, and the desert that had once been simply remote was becoming restricted in a new and institutionalized sense. For now, though, the peak was still accessible to civilians, and Doc was focused on a more immediate problem: finding the money to reopen the shaft. He had convinced a Texas businessman named Charlie Ryan to invest $28,000 in the effort. The deal was exactly the kind of arrangement that desperate men make with impatient investors. Doc would use Ryan's money to fund excavation of the collapsed entry passage, and Ryan would receive a share of the gold when they got back inside. It was, in many ways, a perfectly reasonable business arrangement, except for the small problem that the gold might not be recoverable, or might not be legally sellable even if it were. The relationship deteriorated quickly. Ryan grew suspicious that Doc was not producing results commensurate with his investment. Doc, for his part, grew paranoid that Ryan intended to cut him out, or worse, to take his money and his knowledge of the buried bars' locations and disappear. Doc's response was to move some of those bars he had already extracted and hidden years earlier, relocating them to new desert caches that Ryan could not have known about. He reportedly moved approximately 110 bars to fresh locations before Ryan's patience ran out entirely. The confrontation came in March 1949, near a small town called Hatch, New Mexico, in the flat agricultural land along the Rio Grande. The specific sequence of events remains disputed, filtered as it is through the accounts of interested parties and the subsequent legal proceedings. What is known is that Charlie Ryan shot Milton Noss in the head at close range. Doc died immediately. He was 44 years old. Ryan was tried for murder. His defense, that Noss had threatened to kill Ryan and his family, and that Ryan had acted in self-defense, was accepted by the jury, and he was acquitted. Whether that verdict reflects the truth of the confrontation is a question that has no answer. The man who had been inside the mountain, who had seen whatever was inside to be seen, who alone knew where the hundreds of hidden bars were buried, was dead. Whatever he had known, he had took with him. Ova Noss, despite the divorce, was determined to continue. She would spend the next 30 years pursuing the treasure, fighting the government, and maintaining against all odds and evidence a claim to something she had never personally seen but believed with the completeness of faith. She was, in many ways, the more formidable figure in the story, a woman who had watched her husband descend into a hole in the mountain, seen the bars he brought up, filed the legal claims, and then watched everything fall apart, but who could not bring herself to let go. There is something almost elemental in her persistence, something that goes beyond ordinary stubbornness into a kind of existential commitment. But the expanding military presence at White Sands was about to make her persistence even more complicated. Chapter 4: The Mountain Becomes Federal Ground. The White Sands Missile Range is, in the 21st century, one of the most restricted tracts of land in the United States. It covers approximately 3,200 square miles, an area larger than the state of Delaware. Within its boundaries, the U.S. Army has tested everything from V-2 rockets in the immediate post-war years to modern anti-missile defense systems. The Trinity site, where the first atomic bomb was detonated on July 16, 1945, sits within its perimeter. The range is closed to the public 363 days a year, twice annually on the first Saturdays of April and October. The gates open for carefully managed public visits. Twice a year, for a few hours, the public may stand where the world changed. The proving ground had been expanding steadily since 1944, absorbing terrain across southern New Mexico in stages driven by the operational requirements of the post-war arms race. It incorporated captured German V-2 rockets and the scientists who designed them. Men like Werner von Braun, recruited through Operation Paperclip, along with more than 1,000 other German technical specialists. The first American launch of a modified V-2 from the range took place in 1946. By the time the facility was formally redesignated the White Sands Missile Range in 1958, it had become one of the most significant military installations in the country. In 1955, the range's boundaries were extended to include Victorio Peak. The absorption was, from the Army's perspective, an administrative matter, an extension of a security perimeter to encompass terrain that fell within the range's operational envelope. From Ova Nas's perspective, it was something more sinister, the government placing itself between her and her claim, not through any formal legal disposition, but through the blunt instrument of military authority. She was told that she would be permitted to return to the site when it became convenient, and did not interfere with national security requirements. As a practical matter, that permission never came in any meaningful form, though the promise of it would be used to defer and delay her for many years. What happened next is where the story becomes genuinely strange, and where the question of whether there is actually gold inside Victorio Peak gains a set of witnesses who are difficult to dismiss. In 1958, 3 years after the peak came under military control, a small group of airmen from nearby Holloman Air Force Base began exploring Victorio Peak during off-duty hours. The principal figures were Captain Leonard V. Feig and Airman First Class Thomas Burlett, accompanied by 2 others named Prather and Weisel. These were not civilians with treasure-hunting inclinations. They were military personnel with access to the range who had heard the story of Doc Noss and were curious enough to investigate on their own initiative. Burlett, later in a 1991 interview, was candid about their true purpose. They were hunting for gold, not wildlife. He was 19 years old. Burlett described what the group found in terms that are striking in their specificity. Months of searching eventually led them to a lower entrance to the cavern system within the mountain. Not the upper passage that Doc Noss had used, but a different entry point discovered through independent exploration. What they saw inside aligned in its broad outlines with Doc's descriptions. There were artifacts on the walls, including what Burlett described as a very large wooden cross made up of smaller crosses. There were, in the first room they entered, 2 sacks of gold. Looking further into the cave system with flashlights, they could see a room where the gold was stacked in the shape of a pyramid, with what appeared to be an exit passage, leading toward what they believed was the main chamber Doc had described. What they did next is one of the more baffling decisions in the entire story. Rather than taking any gold, which would have been illegal under the Gold Reserve Act and would also have exposed them to military discipline, Feig deliberately caved in the roof and walls of the entrance tunnel, collapsing it to make it appear the passage simply ended. He did this before reporting the discovery to anyone. His reasoning has never been fully explained. Only after sealing his own find did he and the group begin working through official channels to get back in. They formed a corporation to protect their claim, and then, uncertain of the legal framework governing treasures found on military base, went to the judge advocate's office at Holloman to ask for guidance. This brought their discovery to the attention of a second military command. Colonel Sigmund Goshevich became involved. The story was now in the bureaucratic bloodstream, and the machine began to turn against them. Feig petitioned the Holloman commanding general to allow the group back onto the range. That request was denied. Undeterred, Feig, Burlett, and two colonels, Garman and Goshevich, traveled to Washington and made their case directly to the director of the United States Mint. The director, evidently more irritated than enthused, wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Army suggesting that the simplest way to end the persistent rumors about Victorio Peak gold would be to let Feig's group attempt a retrieval. The letter worked. Major General John Schinkel, commanding White Sands Missile Range, agreed to allow a supervised attempt. On August 5, 1961, a substantial official party went to Victorio Peak. The group included Schinkel himself, Colonel Garman, Feig, Burlett, and their partners, along with WSMR military police and Special Agent L.E. Boggs of the Treasury Department. They worked for 5 days trying to re-enter the tunnel. They failed. The passage they had found in 1958 could not be relocated or penetrated. Schinkel dismissed the group. Feig and Burlett came back in August and September requesting more time, ultimately receiving several more weeks of supervised weekend access under the surveillance of a Captain Orby Swanner, WSMR's chief security. That access also produced nothing officially documented. What Swanner did in his off hours is considerably more interesting. In 1961, while overseeing the Feig group's futile attempts, Swanner apparently entered parts of the mountain independently. He told his brother-in-law, a man named C.G. Irwin, and his sister Juanita, that he had not only confirmed the treasure's existence, but had been part of a Pentagon task force that had inventoried the contents of the cavern. According to Irwin's, Swanner told him the gold had been removed. He asked them to keep this secret, and they did for years. They came forward publicly only after the Unsolved Mystery segment aired in 1989, when Juanita recognized the story her brother had told her decades earlier. What makes the Swanner account more than just hearsay is a detail discovered during the 1977 civilian expedition. Deep inside Victorio Peak, in one of the tunnels the expedition team managed to access, they found an inscription carved into the cave wall. It read, Captain Orby Swanner, 7 October 1961. His military serial number was also included. The inscription is the closest thing to physical corroboration in the entire post-1939 story. A name, a date, and a military identification number in a place that should have been inaccessible to anyone not authorized to be there. The Army, when asked, confirmed that Swanner had indeed served at White Sands during this period. It denied that any official search or removal operation had taken place. It produced no documents of any kind relating to his activities inside the mountain. Some skeptics have noted that soldiers routinely carve their names into rock faces in tunnel walls throughout the White Sands Range as a kind of casual practice, a point that does temper the evidentiary weight of Swanner's inscription, though it does not eliminate it. But the Swanner account taken together with the Burlett and Feig testimony, with the witnesses who reported seeing army trucks and helicopters at the peak in the early 1960s that appeared to be removing something, and with the pattern of official denial without documentation, constitutes a body of specific, named, partially corroborated testimony that cannot be dismissed simply as a rumor. The Army conducted its own official search in 1961. Little is known about what that search found, if anything, because Ova Noss intervened legally, requesting through state officials that the search be halted. Her reasoning was that any gold the Army found would become government property, extinguishing her claim entirely. It was a defensive move, born of the conviction that the treasure was hers. Whether it was wise is another question. The Army complied with the request and stopped the search. A subsequent search in 1963, in which Ova participated along with a limited team, was reported as unsuccessful. Throughout the 1960s, the treasure story circulated in the underground of American rumor, the kind of thing that passed between people who were paying attention to the spaces where official narrative and lived experience diverged. It was known to treasure hunters and legal researchers and journalists, and then, in the early 1970s, it emerged in a setting that no one had anticipated: the United States Senate in the middle of the Watergate hearings. Chapter 5: Watergate, F. Lee Bailey, and the Gold That Went to Washington. The Watergate hearings of 1973 were one of the great public spectacles of 20th century American political life, month-long unfolding of testimony and revelations that eventually brought down a presidency. They were not primarily a venue for treasure stories, but on June 25, 1973, during testimony before the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, the Ervin Committee, named for its chairman, Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, John Dean, the former White House counsel, whose testimony had already detonated several political explosions, mentioned something unexpected. Dean testified that he had been informed by former Attorney General John Mitchell that a lawyer named F. Lee Bailey was representing a group of anonymous clients described as former and current military personnel who were in possession of a very large quantity of gold bars located somewhere in the American Southwest. The gold, Bailey's clients claimed, had come from Victorio Peak. They wanted the government's help in legalizing their possession of it, since private gold ownership was still illegal under the framework that dated back to Executive Order 6102 of 1933. They were, in essence, asking for immunity from prosecution in exchange for surrendering the gold, or for permission to sell it in what would have been an extraordinary private transaction with national treasury implications. The mention was brief and surrounded by far more dramatic material. It was Watergate, after all, but it was enough. The Victorio Peak story had now been entered into the congressional record. John Dean had named it in sworn testimony before a Senate committee. The Alamo Gordo Gold, as it was sometimes called in subsequent newspaper coverage, was now a matter of public record in the most public form imaginable. F. Lee Bailey was, at the time, one of the most famous criminal defense attorneys in the United States, a man who had defended both Dr. Sam Shepard, whose case had inspired the television series The Fugitive, and the Boston Strangler suspect Albert DeSalvo. He was known for his theatrical courtroom style, his willingness to take on high-profile cases, and his genuine strategic intelligence. He was not a credulous person in his involvement in the Victorio Peak matter, representing clients who claimed knowledge of the treasure's location and seeking legal accommodations from the highest levels of government, suggests that he found these clients' claim at least plausible enough to warrant serious legal work. In 1972, Bailey had formally entered the Victorio Peak dispute, representing a coalition that included Ova Noss, a group known as the Fee Group, Violet Noss Yancey, Doc's second wife, a Florida-based treasure hunting organization called Expeditions Unlimited, and approximately 50 other clients in various categories of claim. The legal landscape around Victorio Peak had by this point become extraordinarily complex. There were multiple overlapping claims of varying legal standing, a military installation that controlled all physical access to the site, and a statutory framework around gold ownership that made even a successful recovery potentially criminal. Bailey reportedly told the Senate that given a helicopter and 30 minutes, he could produce 300 gold bars. The claim has the characteristic Bailey quality of the demonstrably specific and the infuriatingly unverifiable. He was not given the helicopter. What the Bailey episode ultimately produced was a compromise. The Army, faced with the publicity generated by the Watergate testimony and the accumulated years of legal pressure from the Noss family and others, agreed to allow a controlled excavation of Victorio Peak. This expedition took place in 1977, and it was supervised, limited, and ultimately disappointing in the way that such officially managed inquiries tend to be. The 1977 expedition was governed by a 2-week time limit imposed by the Army, enough time to begin, but not nearly enough to excavate any meaningful section of the collapsed and rubble-filled passages. Expedition Unlimited, representing the coalition of claimants, went in with equipment and personnel and did what they could in the time allotted. The expedition found no gold. It found no artifacts. It found, reportedly, evidence of previous digging, the kind of scrape marks and disturbed debris that suggested someone had been there before, though whether that someone had found anything was impossible to determine. The Army terminated access at the end of the 2 weeks as promised and declared that no further searches would be permitted. In 1979, Ova Babe Noss died at the age of 79, without having seen the treasure she had believed in for more than 40 years. She had spent half of her adult life in its pursuit, had filed legal claims and fought bureaucratic obstructions, and watched her estranged husband be shot dead in the desert, and still had not let go. Her death did not end the family's involvement. Her grandson Terry Delanis would carry the story forward. Meanwhile, Dan Rather had devoted a segment of 60 minutes to the Victorio Peak story in September 1977, bringing it to a national television audience of many millions. The segment included an interview with Ova Noss, and it had the characteristic 60 minutes quality of presenting the story with a mixture of skepticism and genuine curiosity, leaving audiences with the impression that something was going on here, even if its precise nature was unclear. The treasure story had now been on national television, in the Congressional Record, and in dozens of newspapers and magazines. It was, in every sense that mattered culturally, a story that had escaped the desert. Chapter 6. The Origins. The question of where the treasure came from, assuming it existed, is the most historically interesting question in the entire narrative, because it requires us to move backward through centuries of human activity in the American Southwest and to consider seriously which of the several extraordinary possibilities might be true. Each theory is grounded in real historical events. Each has logical geographical coherence with the location of Victorio Peak, and each has significant evidentiary gaps that prevent confident conclusion. The Spanish conquistadors and Juan de Oñate. The first and most frequently cited theory begins in the 16th century, with the Spanish colonization of what would become New Mexico. Spain's interest in the American Southwest was driven in part by the legend of the seven cities of Cibola, seven mythical cities of gold, whose existence had been suggested by a Moorish slave named Esteban and the survivors of the disastrous Narvaez expedition, who had spent years wandering across the continent after a shipwreck. The legend was almost certainly a distortion of actual Puebloan cities, whose multi-story adobe architecture seen from a distance in the golden light of the Southwest might have suggested to hopeful European eyes the glittering wealth they had been promised. The Spanish conducted a series of major expeditions into the Southwest in the mid-16th century. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led the most famous of these, departing from Mexico in 1540 with 300 European soldiers, 800 indigenous allies, and an enormous support train. He marched through what is now Arizona and New Mexico, reaching as far north as Kansas, and found nothing that resembled the golden cities he had been promised. He returned to Mexico in 1542, his reputation damaged and his expedition a financial loss, though his journey had mapped an enormous territory and generated the detailed accounts that would guide later Spanish colonial policies. The formal colonization of New Mexico began in 1598 under the leadership of Juan de Oñate, a wealthy silver mine owner from Zacatecas who had financed his own colonizing expedition. Oñate is one of the most complicated figures in the history of the American Southwest, a man of genuine administrative capability and strategic vision, who was also capable of extraordinary cruelty toward the indigenous people, whose land he was claiming for Spain. In 1599, following a battle at the pueblo of Acoma, in which a number of Spanish soldiers were killed, Oñate ordered a reprisal that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Acoma people, the enslavement of many survivors, and the amputation of 1 foot from every adult male captive. He was eventually recalled to Mexico City in 1607 and tried for cruelty, though he was ultimately exonerated and died in Spain in 1626. The theory connects to Victorio Peak through the claim that Oñate had accumulated significant quantities of gold and silver during his years in New Mexico, extracted through forced indigenous labor and concealed against the possibility of theft or confiscation. When he was ordered back to Mexico, he could not take it all with him, and portions were allegedly cached in various locations in the San Andreas mountain regions. The theory is supported by the presence of Spanish-era documents and artifacts in Doc Noss's account, the armor, the crosses, the letters, and by the geographical logic of a colonial administrator hiding wealth in the mountains along his operational territory. It is undermined by the absence of any documentary record of such a cache and by the considerable difficulty of moving substantial gold to a remote mountain location without any historical trace. But the documentary absence requires some context to evaluate properly. Spanish colonial record keeping, though more extensive than is sometimes assumed, was also vulnerable to destruction, concealment, and loss over 4 centuries. Many of the documents that survive from the early colonial period in New Mexico are incomplete, damaged, or exist only in later copies that may have introduced errors. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which Pueblo peoples of New Mexico rose against the Spanish colonial administration and drove it entirely from the territory for 12 years, destroyed an enormous quantity of colonial records. Many archives that might have contained evidence of Enote's financial activities were burned or lost in the chaos of events in its aftermath. The absence of documentary trail for a cache hidden in the mountains in this context is less surprising than it might initially appear. A variant of this Spanish theory invokes Father Leroux, an 18th century Jesuit priest who, according to tradition, operated a secret gold mine in the San Andreas Mountains with indigenous labor in the 1700s. The Jesuit order complex relationship with Spanish colonial authority. The order was eventually expelled from Spain's colonial territories in 1767 under King Charles III, who viewed the Jesuits' independent power and wealth as a political threat, adds a layer of plausibility to the idea of a hidden mine whose location would not be entered into official records. A Jesuit mining operation conducted without authorization and in deliberate concealment from colonial administrators would leave exactly the kind of documentary void that characterizes the evidence for the Victorio Peak treasure. The documents that Doc Noss reported finding dated 1797, and including what was described as a translation associated with ecclesiastical authority, might conceivably relate to his tradition, a record of hidden operation made by someone who wanted to preserve knowledge of the location while maintaining its secrecy from casual discovery. The Leroux theory would explain a cache of gold bars, refined product of a hidden mining operation, better than the conquistador theory, which requires the accumulation and transportation of existing gold. Emperor Maximilian's hidden fortune. The second major theory concerns one of the more dramatic episodes in 19th century Mexican history. Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph, Archduke of Austria, was installed as Emperor of Mexico in 1864 under pressure from Napoleon III of France, who had used Mexico's inability to pay its foreign debts as a pretext for military intervention. Maximilian arrived in Mexico as part of a French imperial project, supported by Mexican conservatives who hoped that a European monarch would stabilize the country after years of civil conflict. The reign of Maximilian was marked by his own genuine idealism. He was more liberal in his governance than the conservatives who had invited him expected, and by the fundamental instability of a regime that depended on French bayonets for its existence. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, and the United States was able to turn its attention to the violation of the Monroe Doctrine that Maximilian's presence represented, diplomatic and financial pressure forced Napoleon III to withdraw French troops. Without French support, Maximilian's position became untenable. He rejected advice to abdicate and was captured by forces loyal to the Mexican president Benito Juarez. He was executed by firing squad at Querétaro in June 19, 1867, an event that shocked European sensibilities and ended the Second Mexican Empire. Maximilian was a well-meaning man in an impossible situation by most historical account, genuinely concerned with the welfare of Mexican citizens, more liberal in his politics than his conservative sponsors, but utterly dependent on military force to maintain power in a country whose legal president was conducting a successful resistance campaign. His execution by Juarez, who had won an internationally backed war and had every political reason to make an example, became one of the iconic images of the 19th century, captured in an enormous canvas by the painter Edouard Manet. Maximilian died facing a firing squad with evident composure, reportedly distributing gold coins to the soldiers who were about to shoot him and asking them not to aim at his face. Whatever else he was not a coward. What happened to the imperial treasury is where the legend begins. By 1867, the Mexican Empire was in its death throe, but the core of committed loyalists around Maximilian refused to accept that the imperial cause was finished. With rebel forces controlling much of the countryside and the Gulf ports under threat, moving the treasury by sea was judged too dangerous. Maximilian chose 4 trusted Austrian officers and between 15 and 20 Mexican loyalists and tasked them with loading 15 wagons with what has been estimated at $10 million in gold, silver, and jewels, the accumulated wealth of his 3-year reign, and getting it out of Mexico to neutral territory, where it could be held until the imperial cause could be revived. The route chosen avoided the Gulf ports entirely. The wagons moved north, crossing into Texas, moving through territory that was still sparsely settled and partially lawless in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The Austrian officers needed escort. They enlisted a group of former Confederate soldiers from Missouri, men who had refused to accept the Confederacy's defeat and had spent time in Mexico rather than live under Union authority. The Austrians did not tell their escort what was in the wagons. The Missourians agreed to ride as guards against bandits, an Indian attack on the road to the coast at Indianola. The arrangement held until the convoy reached Castle Gap at the border of Crane and Upton counties in West Texas, near what is today Route 385. There, the Missourians discovered the truth about their cargo. Temptation overwhelmed whatever loyalty the road had built. They shot and killed all 4 Austrian officers and the Mexican driver, buried the treasure at Castle Gap, burned the wagons over the burial site, and rode east toward San Antonio, carrying only as much gold as they could fit into their saddlebags. The story does not end there. Its subsequent unraveling is one of the more darkly comic sequences in the legend. As the 6 Confederate bandits rode east, one of them fell seriously ill at Fort Concho and was left behind by his impatient companions. Recovering enough to ride, he set out to catch up to them and found them sooner than expected, their bodies strewn on the road where they had been killed in an Indian attack. Every man who knew the location of the Castle Gap burial was now dead except him. He rode for Missouri, abandoning any thought of recovering the treasure on his own. But his luck had not improved. Falling in with a group of horse thieves without knowing their trade, He was swept up in their arrest by a posse near Denton, Texas, and jailed. The doctor who attended him in custody told him he was dying, owing a doctor a debt of kindness. The Missouri Confederate drew him a crude map and told him the story before he died. The doctor organized a search near Crane and Upton counties and found nothing. That is the Castle Gap version of the Maximilian treasure story, the most widely circulated variant in which the gold ended up buried in West Texas and has never been recovered. It sits about 200 miles east of Victorio Peak and represents a competing destination for the same imperial treasury. The Victorio Peak variant of the theory diverges at the point of the convoy's route. In this version, the treasure wagons did not take the East Texas Road at all, but instead moved north along the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the same royal road that the Spanish colonists had used for centuries, running north along the Rio Grande through the Jornada del Muerto. This route would have taken the convoy directly past the San Andreas Mountains. According to this version, the wagons were attacked by Apache warriors near the Cabello Mountains along the Jornada del Muerto, the same stretch of desert that had claimed travelers for 3 centuries. The guards were killed. The priests accompanying the convoy were spared and sent away with 1 wagon, and the remaining wagons and their contents were taken into the mountains and hidden underground. The porters who carried the treasure into the caves were left there, as the story goes. The geographical logic of this variant is compelling. The Jornada del Muerto passes within a relatively short distance of the Hembrio Basin. Apache raiders operating in this region in the 1860s were active and effective. The Membras Apache under Mangus Coloradas and his successors controlled the territory between the Rio Grande and the San Andreas Mountains precisely during the period when such a convoy would have passed through. A treasure seized from a Mexican imperial convoy in the 1860s and cached in the mountains along the Jornada del Muerto would be consistent with both the geography and the documented activity of the Apache bands of that era. The specific items Doc Noss described finding inside the mountain fit this theory with some precision. He reported a gold crown, which the Maximilian theory identifies as the jewel-encrusted crown of Empress Carlotta. He reported chests of European mail and jewelry. He reported a gold statue of the Virgin Mary. These are the kinds of objects that might constitute an imperial treasury assembled by an Austrian archduke ruling a Catholic country. Europeans in manufacture, ecclesiastical in character, dynastic in significance. They do not fit as naturally into the Spanish colonial theory, which would more likely produce mining-era bullions and armor, nor into the Apache plunder theory, which would produce coins, weapons, and portable goods from raided settlements. What the Maximilian theory cannot easily account for is the presence of Spanish colonial armor in documents dated to the 16th and 17th centuries, materials that predates Maximilian's empire by 250 years. This is where the most intellectually honest researchers tend to conclude that no single origin theory accounts for everything Doc described, and that if the treasure is real, it represents a multi-layered accumulation. The Padre LaRue mining operation providing the bulk of the gold bars, the Apache raiders adding coins and portable valuables from raids, and the Maximilian convoy contributing the distinctive European imperial items that give Doc's account its most exotic character. Apache plunder in the cache of Chief Victorio. The third theory is perhaps the most geographically elegant because it requires no long-distance transportation at all. Victorio Peak bears the name of the Membra Apache war leader, Victorio, who used the Hembrio Basin as one of his strongholds during the years of guerrilla warfare that bore his name. The Battle of Hembrio Basin, fought in April of 1880 between the U.S. Army's 9th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers and Victorio's warriors, was the largest engagement of Victorio's war in terms of forces engaged. Victorio himself was a figure of considerable historical stature. Born around 1825, he had ridden in his youth with Mangus Coloradus, the paramount leader of the Membra Apache, and had learned from him the tactics of mountain warfare, the use of terrain, the management of water, the art of the ambush. He became chief of a large mixed band of Membra and Mescalero Apache, and from 1879 to 1880, he led a running campaign against the United States Army, the Texas Rangers, and the Mexican Army that involved 24 skirmishes and battles across southern New Mexico, West Texas, and northern Mexico. He was never definitively defeated in battle by American forces, though he was constantly outmaneuvered strategically. He died in October 1880 at the Battle of Tres Castillos in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, where the Mexican army finally killed him and most of his followers. His death was so significant that a memorial statue of Victorio riding a horse stands today in the city of Chihuahua, Mexico. The Battle of Hembrio Basin itself is worth understanding in detail because it is one of the most tactically interesting engagements in the entire history of the Apache Wars. Colonel Edward Hatch planned a classic encirclement operation. 4 columns were converged on Victorio's camp from different directions, cutting off escape routes and concentrating overwhelming force. But the plan depended on coordination that the terrain made impossible. Major Morrow's column to the north could not find water and never reached the battlefield. Captain Carroll, commanding the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th Cavalry, advanced up the Hembrio Valley on April 5th, without knowing that Morrow's column was not in position. What happened next demonstrated why Victorio was regarded by both admirers and enemies as one of the finest tactical commanders of his era. His warriors, occupying the higher ground around the basin in a configuration that gave them both visibility and protected firing position, pinned Carroll's soldiers down on a low ridge. The soldiers were surrounded and cut off from the only nearby water source, a spring that Victorio's men held with repeating rifles. The Buffalo Soldiers held their positions through the night and into the next day, exhausted and thirsty, while Victorio did something even more impressive than winning a battle. He withdrew his women and children from the area entirely, moving them out of the encirclement before superior forces arrived. When additional American units arrived and the tactical situation shifted, Victorio executed a disciplined stage withdrawal, maintaining a rear guard until the morning of April 8th, when that final group retreated after a brief final skirmish. The casualties were light on both sides by standards of conventional war. 2 Buffalo soldiers killed, 5 wounded including Captain Carroll, and 3 Apache bodies reportedly found. But the battle's significance lies not in its casualty count, but in what it demonstrated. Victorio had faced a force that outnumbered his own considerably. had protected his non-combatants, had inflicted casualties while taking minimal losses himself, and left the field on his own terms. It was a tactical exercise nearly perfect, and the ground on which he fought, the Hembrio Basin, with its springs and its mountain stronghold, was territory he knew intimately. This intimacy with the terrain is what gives the Apache plunder theory its geographical logic. A man who knew every spring and passage in the San Andreas Mountains, who had used Victorio Peak as a refuge and stronghold for years, would have known if that mountain contained natural vaults. He would have known its caves, its stable chambers, its hidden passages. If Victorio's band had accumulated plunder from years of raiding, and they had, targeting Wells Fargo shipments, stagecoach lines, settlements, and supply train across an enormous territory, his stronghold at Victorio Peak would be the natural place to store it. Throughout his campaign, Victorio's band raided settlements, stagecoach lines, and supply trains across the territory. They accumulated considerable plunder, gold and silver coins, weapons, provisions, livestock, and various valuables taken from people and institutions they raided. The theory holds that some of this plunder was cached at or within Victorio Peak. This would explain several distinctive features of Doc Noss's account: the presence of artifacts from multiple time periods, the eclectic mix of gold coins and bars alongside Spanish-era relics, the location of the cache at Victorio's known stronghold. The theory has an appealing internal logic, but it faces a significant problem of scale. Stagecoach raids and settlement looting, however systematic, do not typically produce 15,000 to 16,000 gold bars. They produce coins, silvers, portable valuables, not refined bullions in industrial quantities. For the Apache plunder theory to account for the quantity of gold Doc described, it would have to incorporate multiple other sources, which is where the theories begin to overlap and combine. Pancho Villa and the German connection. The fourth theory is the most recent in its historical setting, and, it must be said, the most speculative in its construction. It begins with the complex geopolitical situation of the years before and during World War I, specifically with the relationship between Germany and Mexico. Germany has strategic reasons to destabilize the United States border during the war years. A Mexico engaged in internal conflict, potentially threatening American security on its southern border, would divert American attention and resources from Europe. The Zimmermann Telegram of 1917, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico and offered to help Mexico recover its lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, is the most famous expression of this strategic interest. The telegram, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, contributed substantially to the American decision to enter the war. The connection to Victorio Peak comes through Francisco Pancho Villa, the revolutionary leader whose complex role in the Mexican Revolution included periods of American support, American hostility, and an infamous raid on Columbus, New Mexico in March 1916 that killed American civilians and soldiers and prompted the punitive expedition led by General John Pershing into Mexico. The theory suggests that Villa received German gold as part of a covert arrangement to fund revolutionary activities that would tie down American military resources, and that some of this gold, transported north into New Mexico, was hidden in the San Andreas Mountains. Villa's raiders were known to operate in the region of Otero County in southern New Mexico, and his network of supply caches was real and documented, though its full extent was never mapped. The theory would explain the presence of 19th and early 20th century coins and artifacts alongside older material if the Victorio Peak cache represented an accumulation from multiple sources over time rather than a single deposit. What it cannot easily explain is the presence of Spanish colonial armor and artifacts dated to the 16th and 17th centuries, which suggests that something was in that mountain long before Villa's era. The Villa Germany theory is treated by most mainstream historians as the least well supported of the major theories, largely because the scale of any German covert gold transfer would have left documentary traces that have not materialized. But the absence of documentation in the world of covert operations is not the same as absence of the operation itself. And the theory's proponent note that the clandestine nature of such a program would be precisely the reason its records do not exist. The skeptical view: there is no treasure. No honest account of the Victorio Peak story can omit the possibility that the simplest explanation is the correct one, that Doc Noss found a small cave, perhaps with some minor historical artifacts, perhaps with a few Spanish-era coins or relics, and that the treasure he described grew in the telling until it became something unrecognizable from whatever he actually found. The skeptical case rests on several points. Doc Noss brought out no physical evidence that has survived in a form that can be independently verified. The bars he allegedly brought out are not accounted for. His behavior throughout the period following the supposed discovery: paranoid, secretive, erratic, dishonest with investors, is consistent with either a man sitting on a genuine fortune he cannot use, or a con artist managing an ongoing fraud. The physical dimensions of the discovery as described: 15,000 bars stacked in multiple rooms accessible only through a 100-foot vertical crevice. Strange geological plausibility. The Army's multiple searches found nothing officially acknowledged. No institutions that has had physical access to the site has ever confirmed finding anything. It is also worth noting that Doc Noss was not without experience in the arts of persuasion. A man who had operated a traveling medicine show understood the value of a compelling story, understood how to calibrate a claim to the audience's credulity, and understand that the best stories have enough specific detail to seem anchored in reality. The number 16,000 bars is extraordinarily precise for a figure arrived at in the dark with a flashlight, squinting into a cavern. The detail about bars stacked like firewood is picturesque and memorable, in a way that more cautious observers might describe as suspiciously so. These details could be natural language of genuine astonishment, or they could be the calculated details of a practiced storyteller. The evidence does not permit certainty on this point. Against this, the skeptics must account for the Burlett testimony. They must account for the multiple military personnel who reported finding caverns in gold. They must explain why F. Lee Bailey, a shrewd attorney not given to credulity, found his client's claim credible enough to take to the Attorney General of the United States. They must explain the evidence of clandestine excavations found by the 1977 expedition team. They must explain why, if there was nothing there, the Army would impose strict time limits on civilian searches rather than simply allowing thorough investigation that would definitively prove the negative. These are not the kind of details that fit easily into a pure fraud narrative. The most intellectually honest position is probably that Doc Noss found something real, likely a cave system containing historical artifacts and possibly some gold, but that the scale and value of what he described has been amplified over decades of retelling, legal maneuvering, and wishful projection. Whether it constitutes a significant treasure is a question the sealed mountain has not answered. Chapter 7: The Geophysics of Mystery. In 1990, a geophysicist named Lambert Dolphin was engaged by the Ulva-Noss Family Partnership to conduct a scientific survey of Victorio Peak. Dolphin was a senior research physicist at the Stanford Research Institute, and he brought a range of sophisticated geophysical instruments to bear on the mountain. His methods included ground-penetrating radar, acoustic sensing, and other technologies designed to detect subsurface features without requiring physical excavation. Dolphin's results were significant and have been cited extensively by those who believe in the treasure. His survey detected anomalies consistent with the presence of large underground chambers within the mountains, voids, essentially, that matched in their general size and location the descriptions that Doc Noss and Ulva-Noss had provided over the years. The caverns appeared to be real, or at least the geophysical data was consistent with their reality. Dolphin reportedly stated that the features he detected seemed to match the description from the Noss family accounts. This is a meaningful finding, though it requires careful handling. Ground-penetrating radar and acoustic sensing can detect voids in rock, but they cannot determine what is inside those voids. The presence of large underground chambers within Victorio Peak means that Doc's basic geological claim that there are significant cave systems within the mountain may be accurate. It does not tell us whether those chambers contain gold bars or Spanish armor or anything at all beyond air and limestone. But it does shift the conversation away from the question of whether Doc was lying about the mountain's interior structure and toward the question of what specifically he found there. The geology is relevant here in a deeper way. The San Andreas Mountains are composed largely of carbonate rocks, limestone, and dolomite, that are precisely the type of rocks in which karst cave systems develop. The same acidic groundwater dissolution that created Carlsbad Cavern operates throughout this region, and the development of large underground chambers in the limestone is not merely possible, but expected. The presence of natural cave systems within Victorio Peak would be geologically unremarkable. What would be remarkable is the presence of 15,000 gold bars inside those caves, and on that question, geophysics can tell us nothing. Karst caves in the southwest typically develop along fault lines in bedding plains, the natural weaknesses in the rock where water can penetrate and begin its dissolving work. Over millions of years, a single hairline crack can become a passage large enough to walk through. The process is continuous. Caves in active karst terrain are still developing, still changing, still finding new paths through the rock. The instability that Doc feared when the mining engineer was considering his dynamite was real and well-founded. Cave systems in limestone are dynamic structures, subject to collapse and rearrangement as water continue its slow work. The 1939 explosion, which Doc had argued against, may have triggered a collapse in a geological structure that was already close to its limits. This same geological dynamism means that the passages within Victorio Peak may have changed substantially since 1937, even if Doc's description of the cave system was accurate at the time. The structure he navigated may no longer exist in the same configuration. Passages may have further collapsed, chambers may have shifted. The route he knew, the vertical fissure, the squeeze under boulders, the series of connected rooms, may be so altered as to be unrecognizable, even if a new entrance can be found. Chapter 8. The Family Carries On. Terry Delanis was Ovanos's grandson, and after her death in 1979, he became the most persistent family advocate for the treasure claim. In 1992, he organized the Ovanos Family Partnership to pool resources and coordinate the ongoing legal and physical search. The partnership brought together family members and investors under a formal organizational structure, reflecting the lesson that decades of informal effort had taught, that without organization and legal standing, the claim was vulnerable to being simply ignored. The partnership secured Army permission for a new series of excavations at the site, and the work that followed spanned several years in the 1990s, making it the most sustained physical effort at the peak since Doc's own work in the late 1930s. The excavation employed professional archaeologists and geophysicists, as well as family members, and the reports from this period suggest that the team found evidence of historical activity at the site, cave systems, structural features, and inscriptions that aligned with aspects of the Nos family accounts. But the goal remained elusive, and in March 1996, the Army suspended the family's access to the site. The reason given was insufficient to satisfy the family, and the suspension fell to Delanis and his associates, like a continuation of the pattern of official obstruction that had characterized the case from the beginning. The Army's position throughout this entire period had been carefully calibrated to neither confirm nor deny. White Sands Missile Range acknowledged the site's existence and confirmed that searches had been permitted. It maintained access restrictions based on the operational requirement of an active military installation. It never officially stated that it had found gold, and it never officially stated that gold could not be there. This deliberate neutrality, a kind of institutional neither here nor there, satisfied no one and fueled conspiracy theories in proportion to its ambiguity. Multiple witnesses, including servicemen who were stationed at White Sands in various capacities, have reported seeing evidence of clandestine digging at the peak, roads built across the desert floor toward the mountain, scaffolding and excavation equipment, activities conducted at night, or during periods when civilian access was restricted. One account describes a journalist named Gus Moreland, who reported seeing, after receiving a tip from a military source and returning to the peak under cover of darkness, the remains of extensive excavations. Roads, scaffolds, tunnels, with no sign of personnel or equipment. He reported his observation to military authorities, received assurances that the digging had stopped, and found on a subsequent visit that it was entirely deserted. The government's standard response to these allegations is flat denial. The Army has consistently maintained that it has not conducted unauthorized excavations at Victorio Peak and has not removed gold or artifacts from the site. This denial is either the truth, in which case the treasure either was never there or remained sealed in the mountain, or it is a lie, in which case the institutional capacity for sustained deception over more than 70 years is itself a remarkable achievement. What makes the government removal theory compelling to many is not simply the allegation of individual witnesses, but the pattern of behavior. The termination of the 1977 expedition at the 2-week limit, the suspension of the 1990s excavation without satisfying explanation, the aerial photographs that reportedly showed road network crisscrossing the peak, the persistent refusal to allow any genuinely independent, open-ended investigation of the site. Whether this pattern reflects deliberate concealment or simply the ordinary institutional behavior of a military installation protecting its operational security is a question of interpretation. Chapter 9. Watergate's Echo in the Political Labyrinth. The mention of Victorio Peak gold in the Watergate hearing has generated its own sub-literature of speculation, much of it connecting the treasure to various figures in the Nixon administration and beyond. What Dean said was that former Attorney General John Mitchell had told him that F. Lee Bailey represented clients, reportedly including current or former military personnel, who had gold bars in their possession, believed to be from Victorio Peak, and who wanted legal accommodations from the federal government to surrender or sell the gold without facing prosecution under the laws that then made private gold ownership illegal. The request had apparently been discussed at senior levels of the Justice Department during the Nixon administration, though it had not been acted upon. This is taken at face value not an allegation of government theft. It is an account of private individuals, including some with military connections, who claimed to have gold and wanted to legitimize their possessions of it. But the questions it raises are obvious and important. If these individuals had gold bars that they claimed came from Victorio Peak, where did they get them? Had they removed them from the mountain during the period of military control? Were they among the servicemen who had reported finding gold in the mountain during the late 1950s and early 1960s? Were they the same individual whose interests Bailey has been representing when he sought permission to excavate in the early 1970s? None of these questions has been definitively answered. The clients Bailey represented remain anonymous in the Watergate testimony, and, as far as the public record shows, have never been identified. The gold bars that Bailey reportedly submitted as samples to the Treasury Department, described as containing 60% gold, were apparently examined and then disappeared from the official narrative without further public accounting. The connection to the Nixon administration, however tangential the actual documented evidence, has made the Victorio Peak story a natural attachment point for broader narratives about government secrecy and the abuse of institutional power. In the context of a historical moment when the American public was learning the extent to which the executive branch had been conducting itself in ways that were inconsistent with democratic norms, the idea that the same administration might also be sitting on someone else's treasure was not a difficult narrative to construct. The Victorio Peak treasure story shares this quality with many of the great American mystery narratives. It exists at the intersection of documented fact and documented institutional dishonesty, in a space where the ordinary rules of evidence are complicated by the known tendency of powerful institutions to conceal things. When the government lies about some things, the ground shifts for everything the government says. This is not an argument for accepting every conspiracy theory. It is an argument for understanding why conspiracy theories flourish in the specific soil of post-Watergate America. Chapter 10. The Apache Question. There's a dimension of the Victorio Peak story that tends to get less attention than the treasure itself, but that is in many ways the most morally significant. The question of indigenous rights and the colonial history that the treasure, in whatever theory of its origin one accepts, represents. Victorio Peak and the Hembrio Basin lie within the traditional territory of the Membra Apache people. The battle fought there in April 1880 was part of a campaign in which the United States Army was attempting to force Chief Victorio and his followers to accept confinement on a reservation far from their homeland, the San Carlos Reservation in southeastern Arizona, a location that the Membra people found both alien and hostile. The San Carlos Reservation was notoriously harsh, a low-elevation desert environment that was radically different from the mountain homeland that the Membra Apache had occupied for generations, shared with other Apache groups who were sometimes rival and administered with bureaucratic indifference to indigenous welfare that was characteristic of the period. The refusal to accept that confinement was the immediate cause of Victorio's war, and the war ended with Victorio's death and the destruction of most of his band. The deeper context here is important. The Membra Apache people had been in the Chihuahuan Desert and the mountains surrounding it for centuries before the Spanish arrived. Their knowledge of the terrain, the springs, the passes, the caves, the seasonal routes of game, was an accumulated wisdom of generations lived in intimate relationship with a specific landscape. When Victorio used the Hembrio Basin as a stronghold, he was not simply choosing a convenient military position. He was returning to ground that his people had known and used for a very long time. The peak that now bears his name was likely a known feature of the Membra Apache landscape, long before a Spanish or Anglo name was applied to it. The story of the Victorio Peak treasure has been told almost exclusively from the perspective of those who want the gold, the Nas family, treasure hunters, lawyers, the army, the federal government. The perspective of the Apache people, whose ancestral territory this is and whose chief's name the peak bears, has been largely absent from the public narrative. When it has appeared, it has often been in the form of assertions made with particular passion in some online discussion of the treasure, that any gold found in those mountains belongs not to the Nas family, not to the federal government, and not to any treasure hunter, but to the Apache people whose land was taken and whose history is written in the rock of the San Andreas Mountains. This argument has a moral force that the legal argument around treasure trove laws do not adequately address. The legal framework for treasure claims in New Mexico and under federal law is designed to allocate found property among competing claimants according to who made the discovery and who holds the underlying land rights. It is not designed to address the prior question of how the land came to be owned by anyone other than the people who had lived on it for centuries. That prior question sits underneath the entire Victorio Peak narrative, unacknowledged and unresolved. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which established procedures for the return of Native American cultural items and human remains to lineal descendants and cultural affiliates, is relevant here in ways that have rarely been discussed in the context of the treasure. If the caverns within Victorio Peak contain human remains, and Dog Nas's account specifically describes dozens of skeletons, the question of who those people were and what rights their descendants have over the remains and any associated objects is not a trivial one. The chained skeleton in Doc's account could represent any number of things: indigenous slaves of the colonial period, victims of whatever violence secured the treasure's hiding, or something else entirely. But if they are indigenous remains, the legal and ethical framework for their treatment is substantially different from the framework that governs gold bars. If the treasure is real, and if it includes material that were in the mountain before European contact, which none of the major theories suggest, but which cannot be entirely ruled out, the indigenous rights question becomes even more pointed. Even under theories that attribute the treasure to Spanish colonial activities, the labor that extracted the gold was almost certainly indigenous labor, extracted under conditions of coercion. The gold in those bars, wherever they came from, passed through the hands and lives of people whose descendants are still present in the Southwest, and whose relationship to that history is not merely symbolic. None of this means that the Noss family's claim is invalid on its own terms, or that the legal arguments around the treasure are unimportant. It means that the story is larger and more complicated than a tale of one man finding a hole in a mountain. The Victorio Peak treasure, if it exists, is not simply a windfall waiting for the right claimant. It is a condensation of centuries of violence, exploitation, displacement, and loss, a physical record of the history of the American Southwest, written in gold. Chapter 11. The Century After. The Victorio Peak treasure story has been with us now for nearly 90 years. It has generated books, television segments, legal filings, congressional testimony, and a Discovery Channel documentary series. It has consumed multiple generations of one family. It has brushed against some of the largest events in 20th century American history: the atomic age, the Cold War, Watergate. And after all of that, the mountain has not given up its answer. The physical situation at Victorio Peak in 2026 is essentially unchanged. The peak lies within the White Sands Missile Range, accessible only under military permission that has not been granted to the Noss family or any other civilian claimants in recent decades. The upper entrance discovered by Doc Noss collapsed in 1939 and has never been reopened. The lower entrance found by the Holloman Air Force officers in 1958 was sealed by their own dynamite charge. The collapsed passages within the mountains have been further modified by the Over-Noss Family Partnership's excavation in the 1990s, and by whatever clandestine activity may or may not have occurred before and after those efforts. Lambert Dolphin's geophysical survey from 1990 suggested the presence of significant underground chambers. That findings has not been refuted, though neither has it been followed up by any official excavation that has reported its findings publicly. The mountain contains something, at minimum, a cave system whose shape corresponds broadly to the description in the Noss family accounts. Whether that cave system contains gold is a question that the mountain's inaccessibility has preserved from resolution. The gold bars that Doc Noss reportedly removed from the mountains and buried in the desert are another unresolved element. If he removed 200 bars over the period from 1937 to 1939, and if those bars were then buried in various locations in the Hembrio Basin and surrounding desert, some number of them may still be in the ground. The story of Tony Jolly, described as a man who helped Doc hide the bars and who reportedly returned years later and recovered 10 of them, is, like much else in this narrative, unverifiable but not implausible. The broader question that the Victorio Peak story raises about the relationship between citizens and the institutions that control access to potentially significant sites on public or federal land has lost none of its relevance. The White Sands Missile Range exists for legitimate national security purposes, and those purposes are not pretextual. The range has been a genuine center of American weapons development for 80 years, and the restrictions on civilian access exists for real reasons. But the legitimacy of those restrictions in general does not resolve the specific question of whether those restrictions have been used to foreclose a legitimate civilian claim. The Discovery Channel series that aired in January 2023, titled Gold Lies in Videotape, represents the most recent mainstream media engagement with the story, bringing new technologies and new investigative approaches to a narrative that has resisted resolution for generations. The 6-part series attempted to trace the full lineage of the claim, from Doc's original descent to the current state of the Noss family's legal efforts, using ground-penetrating technology, historical archival research, and interviews with surviving witnesses and family members. What it demonstrated, if nothing else, is that the story has not exhausted itself. Nearly 90 years after Doc Noss felt a current of air on his leg and looked down at a hole in the desert, there are still people willing to spend significant resources in pursuit of what he said was inside the mountain. The broader pattern of the story, discovery, obstruction, legal battle, brief official access, termination of access, has repeated itself enough times to suggest that whatever is or was inside Victorio Peak, the institutional response to the claim has been remarkably consistent. Controlled access, limited time, official findings of nothing, suspension of access. This pattern can be explained innocently. The Army grants access when political pressure demands it, imposes constraints consistent with operational security, finds nothing because there is nothing to find, and revokes access when the political pressure subsides. It can also be explained less innocently. The consistent refusal of genuinely open-ended, independent investigation, the kind that would allow outside scientists and archaeologists to work without a military-imposed deadline, is a structural feature of the story that no innocent explanation fully accounts for. Lambert Dolphin's geophysical findings from 1990 remain the most significant piece of physical evidence on the side of the treasure's existence. Dolphin was not a treasure hunter with a financial stake in the outcome. He was a senior research physicist, deploying scientific instruments to answer a specific question, and his instruments suggested that the underground structure of Victorio Peak matched the description provided by the Noss family. Whatever one makes of the treasure theory, the geological argument that the mountain contains significant cave systems is supported by scientific methodology. Chapter 12. What we are left with. Let us settle into the soft uncertainty of what we actually know, and what we are left holding when the lights are low and the desert outside is quiet. We know that Milton Doc Noss was a real person who made real legal filings asserting that he found something of value inside Victorio Peak. We know that Ova Babe Noss corroborated his account and spent 4 decades of her life in pursuit of it. We know that multiple military personnel, operating independently, reported finding caverns in gold within the mountains during the late 1950s. We know that F. Lee Bailey, a lawyer of considerable acuity, found the claims of his client credible enough to bring the highest level of federal government. We know that John Dean mentioned the treasure in sworn congressional testimony during the Watergate hearing. We know that geophysical surveys have detected anomalies consistent with significant underground chambers within the mountain. We know that the Army has permitted controlled excavation over the years and that none of them has produced an official finding of gold or an official finding of nothing. We also know something about human nature. When people find significant wealth, they typically behave in ways that are consistent with having found significant wealth. They become secretive, they become paranoid about theft, they make investments and purchases that require explanation. They tell people. Doc Noss's behavior after 1937, the paranoia and secrecy, is consistent with a man managing a genuine secret under extraordinary pressure. It is also consistent with a con artist whose story had grown beyond his control. The behavioral pattern, in other words, is genuinely ambiguous. Babe Noss, who lived to 79 without ever descending into the cave herself, who saw only what Doc brought up to her, who spent 30 years after his death pursuing something she had never personally witnessed in its full form. She deserves particular consideration. She was not, by any account, a credulous person. People who knew her described her as shrewd, practical, and stubborn, in the way of women who have survived difficult lives. Her persistence was not the persistence of a naive believer. It was the persistence of someone who had seen enough to be convinced, and who could not find a way to let go of what she was convinced of. Whether her conviction was correct is a separate question from whether it was genuine. It was genuine. What we do not know is whether the treasure as described by Doc Noss exists in anything approaching the quantity he claimed. We do not know whether any gold that was there has been removed by military personnel, government officials, or the private clients of F. Lee Bailey. We do not know which, if any, of the origin theories is correct. We do not know whether the cave systems within the mountains are still accessible through any known passage, or whether the decades of explosions and excavations have rendered the interior a chaos of rubble without pattern. There is a version of this story that ends with the government having quietly removed everything in the 1950s and 60s, with the subsequent searches permitted as a kind of theater to manage political pressure, and with the true story filed away in a classified document that will be released sometime in the next century when it no longer matters. There is another version, in which the treasure never existed in any quantity close to what Doc described, and in which the decades of legal battle and obsession represent a kind of collective hallucination seeded by one man's talent for the compelling story. There's a third version, perhaps the most interesting, in which the treasure exists, substantially intact, sealed behind collapsed rock in a cave system that geophysical instruments have detected, but that no one, for reasons of law and military authority, has been able to reach. In this version, the gold is simply waiting. None of these versions can be ruled out. All three have evidence in their favor. The Victorio Peak treasure story is unusual among American mysteries in that its core factual question, is there gold in that mountain, remained genuinely open despite nearly 90 years of effort. Most mysteries of this vintage have resolved, or at least attenuated, as the principals die and the evidence disperses. This one has not. The principals have died, but new ones have emerged. The legal claims have lapsed and been refiled and lapsed again. The mountain has been examined, photographed from the air, probed with radar, and still has not given up its answers. The San Andreas Mountains keep their silence. The desert around them continues its slow process of change. The peak stands where it has always stood, whatever its interior contains, unchanged by the human drama that has played out at its base for nearly a century. There is something almost comforting in this. The mountain does not care about the legal disputes. It does not care about the Army's classifications or the Noss family's legal filings or F. Lee Bailey's helicopter. It does not care about the Watergate hearings or the Discovery Channel documentary. It is simply there, in the way that mountains are simply there, older than any of the stories told about them, more permanent than any of the people who have pressed their faces against their rock and said, "I know there's gold inside you." The human dimension of this story, the 70+ years of obsession, litigation, heartbreak, and occasional violence, has a quality that transcends the question of whether the gold is actually there. Even if the last gold bar was removed by a government agency in 1955 and has been sitting in some classified storage facility for 70 years, the story of the people who spent their lives pursuing it remains meaningful. Ova Noss devoted most of her productive adult years to a claim she never abandoned. Terry Delanis carried a legacy he did not choose but accepted. Lambert Dolphin aimed his instruments at a mountain that might or might not contain what everyone was looking for, and found something that at least validated the geological possibility. F. Lee Bailey was doing what lawyers do, representing people who had a claim and needed someone to argue it. And Doc Noss, who started it all, descending alone into a mountain in the November desert with a flashlight and a rope. Whatever he found, whatever he saw, whatever combination of truth and embellishment and wishful projection produced the story he told for the rest of his life. He was doing what humans have always done in the presence of something that might be extraordinary. Maybe there is gold, maybe there is not. Maybe there was and there is no longer. The desert will not tell us. And there is something in that refusal that feels almost like wisdom. The Hembrio Basin receives the dark like an offering, the stars appearing one by one above the San Andreas, the air cooling to the particular clarity that desert air achieves when sun goes down. The peak is a shadow among shadows. The old question, is there gold in that mountain, dissolves into the night, and there is nothing left but the sound of the wind moving through the creosotes in the vast indifferent silence of the desert, holding its secrets the way deserts always have.